Rare is the wine that spends more time in a barrel. Rare are the vineyards that flourish in a more harsh and unforgiving land. Rare is the grape that is harvested by hand and crushed by foot. The wine is port, and this is Ports to Remember. A discovery of port wine from the grapes to the glass. Come, savor the wine, harvest the grapes, get to know the place and the people whose lives have been wrapped in the joy of port wine for generations. Join your host, wine writer and connoisseur Tony Aspler, in this celebration of Ports to Remember.
Well, treading the grapes to make port is perhaps the most romantic aspect of making this wine. Stay with me. When Ports to Remember returns, we'll look at the age-old tradition of treading grapes in lagars. Well, if you want to know what it's like to tread grapes, it's rather like wading through cold porridge, which is sticky and it's also scratchy because of all the stems and the pits. And my hands are sticky, but I loved it. We're pressing grapes in a lagar. It's made of stone, solid granite, and has been used for generations. Throughout the Douro Valley in northern Portugal, men and women still tread grapes where their grandfathers and great-grandfathers also made wine. This is one of the many contrasts I find throughout my port tours. The soft grape crushed against the unyielding stone. Today, only the best grapes are pressed this way because mechanical means are more efficient. Still, the foot remains the best tool. It has the right amount of give to press the grapes and not crush the stems or seeds. That way, there's less tannin released for a smoother wine. But right now, the wine does not feel smooth at all. It's cold and sticky and a lot of hard work. Treading the grapes goes on until midnight, sometimes with the help of musicians, sometimes playing games to break the monotony. It's a long, long day for these men. They set out to the vineyard to pick grapes some 15 hours ago. At first light every morning of the harvest, teams of pickers called rogas set to work. They return to the same vineyards year after year, and in the fields you'll often see 3 generations at work. Women picking, the young carrying smaller loads, and the experienced men the large loads. It's easier for men, she says, because they used to carry the grapes from here right to the lagars perhaps a mile away, and all uphill. Now tractors do the hard work. Well, not all of it.
Okay. Holy Jesus!
Okay.
Okay. Now where? Okay. This is really heavy and coming uphill. And these guys, they do it, what, 80, 100 times a day. Oh boy.
I think if I survived a day at this job, I'd be a foot shorter. Those grapes are really heavy, And this is not nearly as steep as some of the vineyards in this valley. Just look around. The Douro Valley is harsh and steep and rocky. These are called the Vineyards of Hercules, for good reason. Most of the hills are so steep, people have built terraces, some 6 meters high, to support 2 or 3 rows of vines against the hills. Here it is said, the grapes eat lava and drink sunshine. This is another wonderful contrast. This harsh and unforgiving land produces the perfect sweet grape for port wine. In fact, the more unforgiving the terrain, the better the grape. In some areas, where the slopes are gentle, vintners have made vertical plantings, where the rows of vines go down the hill instead of across it in terraces. They've also put in patamares, which are terraces that stand without walls. But generally, these plantings are rare. This is a vineyard for mountain goats. What's as unforgiving as the lay of this land is the land itself. Port grapes grow in a layered rock, something like shale. It's called schist, and it's as hard as granite. Let me show you. This land of rock is the hardest in the world in which to grow grapes, and you'll understand why in a minute. Fernando, good luck.
Obrigado.
Planting in the Douro Valley calls for extreme measures. To plant a new rootstock, you dig through the thin topsoil and into the rock with heavy steel. Then to get the roots started, you often need dynamite. It's a ticklish job. The measure of explosive has to fracture the rock without disturbing the terrace walls. And it works. Parts of this great wall of terraces have stood for centuries. Much to my relief, there is wonderful respite in this harsh environment. Many wine farms, called quintas, have beautiful green gardens, oases with fountains, pools, and inevitably, incredible views. Here at Quinta de Bom Retiro, which literally means Farm of the Good Retreat, it's an oasis in a land of rock, and it could be called an analogy for port wine itself, because this beautiful place was hewn out of the stark landscape that is the Douro Valley. Surrounded by such stunning beauty, I feel like I've stepped into another time. The fog of early autumn cloaks the river far below and adds a touch of mystery. The Douro Valley is a breathtaking place, a must-visit for port lovers. Many quintas offer rooms, like a bed and breakfast, for tourists to drink in the place where port wine begins, and always to savor a look out at the river. The Douro River flows throughout the entire history of port. Once it was the only way to carry the casks or pipes to the cellars. The boats they used are called barcos rebellos, the boats with the tails, named for the long steering sweep off the high stern. The flat-bottom boat was designed to shoot the rapids, and they were fierce with huge standing waves and heart-sinking drops. Today, the river is much quieter, smooth, and serene. The rapids have been tamed by locks. Today, tour boats and pleasure craft ply the waters, but for some, it's still a highway. And part of its history lives on. Stay with me. When Ports to Remember returns, we'll travel down the Douro to where the river loses itself in the Atlantic, at the cities of Porto and Villanova de Gaia. The two cities of Porto and Villanova de Gaia sit astride the mouth of the Douro River on the Atlantic coast of northern Portugal. Porto, on the north side, gave its name to the country and its wine, and is today the country's business center. The thriving vigor and modern style contrast with its sculptures and Baroque architecture. The people are friendly, ambitious, and fiercely competitive. Just mention football or soccer and watch the debate begin. Even in a street game like this one called Boro, the people of Porto play to win. Porto is a fascinating city, and if you're here to begin a tour of the port region, there is a British bastion to see first. The factory house is remarkable, square and Georgian, built solidly with the expectations of centuries. It was built almost 250 years ago as a meeting place for English factors, the British businessmen who controlled the port trade at the time. Every Wednesday, for more than 200 years, British port producers have met over lunch to discuss and exchange news of the port trade. Another port wine tradition in Porto is of a more recent vintage. I'm here in the Palacio de Bolsa in Porto, where the induction of 50 new members of the Confrérie of Port Wine is about to take place. The Brotherhood of Port was created in 1982. Each year, the internization ceremony honors people who have contributed to the worldwide port trade and welcomes them into the Brotherhood. The robe is part of the heraldry of the port trade and is worn at other celebrations, like the annual festivities on St. John's Day, the patron saint of the city of Porto. For all their hard work and competitive nature, the people of Porto also have fun. I'm standing here on the quayside at Porto, and behind me is the city of Villanova de Gaia. It is here that the Douro River, which starts in Spain as the Duero and flows into Portugal as the Douro, ends up here in Porto and Villanova de Gaia, and it empties into the Atlantic at Foz. And it's at Foz where the regatta, featuring those old barca vela, those old boats, will begin, and they'll race to the bridge behind me. That bridge was actually designed by Eiffel, the designer of the Eiffel Tower, and it is a World Heritage Site. At the annual Feast of St. John, the port producers bring out the boats, restored or replicas of the Barcos Rebellos, for a 5-kilometer race from the Atlantic Ocean to the Don Luis Bridge. The St. John celebrations begin early. At the market, people buy long garlic flowers. They tap others on the head with them for luck. And if they don't have garlic, they use squeaky plastic hammers. The celebration continues all day and long into the night, and the squeak of plastic hammers is heard throughout it all, until silenced by the burst of fireworks over the city. Across the river from Porto, Villanova de Gaia is the home of the port lodges, the buildings that house the offices, blending rooms, and cellars where the port wine ages. Many of these buildings are centuries old. Even the most recent was rebuilt in the stone shell of a venerable old structure. Some port lodges are high, overlooking the Douro and Porto. Others are right on the river's edge, and occasionally the river drops in for a visit. Carlem's Lodge is set on the quay in Villanova de Gaia, and of course when the water rises, and sometimes it does, there are floodings in the cellar. Here we see that in 1989, on December the 22nd, the water level came up to here. In 78, up to here, and so on. The record was in 1909, when it actually reached that height. And of course, when water comes into the cellars, these barrels will float. Although they are impermeable, they're made of wood, they do float. And so in order to keep them in place, they are chained in position. When there are flood warnings, barrels like this are actually chained to the floor by means of hooks, cemented into the floor like this. Through the ebb and flow of the Douro River, these casks are the resting place for port wine. The new wine is here, waiting its turn. Blends are here, waiting to be bottled. And bottles are here, maturing through the years. Some of them, a precious few, date all the way back to Wellington, Napoleon, and the Battle of Waterloo. Stay with me. When Ports to Remember returns, we'll look at how port wines are blended. Port is shipped to the lodges in Villanova de Gaia from thousands of vineyards. In fact, there are several thousand quintas in the Douro region, and there are subtle differences in the wine each produces, not only from one quinta to another, but from one year to the next. This, of course, is the nerve center of all port houses. It's where they blend and put together their different ports. Tasting, blending, that's what it's all about. So let's find out how it's done. Tasting begins as soon as the wines arrive from the quintas, when the port may be only a few months old. Blenders decide what port the very young wines are best suited for, ruby, tawny, or vintage, and begin aging the wines toward that end. It's quite amazing how well they can guide the wine towards the finished product, and the effect of subtle differences in the aging process. For one thing, they age ruby ports in very large vats. That minimizes the oxidation, so the port stays deep red with a full, rich, fruity taste. Smaller casks allow more oxidation, and the result is a tawny-colored wine with a nutty, complex taste. Blending is an exacting process based entirely on the sensitivity and skill of the master blenders. They may blend 100 different elements to produce a single wine. And even within broad classifications of port, as regulated by the governing body, the Port Wine Institute, there are differences in the style from one port house to another. It's a wonderfully creative process. As one renowned master told me, the wines are like notes on a piano, and he's composing a masterpiece to be enjoyed perhaps generations later when the bottle is opened. Decanting is one of the ceremonies of port wine. On some occasions, the process may start with red-hot tongs to heat the neck of the bottle. By breaking the glass, you don't have to remove the cork that sometimes becomes glued inside the bottle. In my experience, however, this is rarely necessary. In all the bottles of port I've ever opened, only one cork was stuck. Decanting, on the other hand, is essential for ports that have been aged in bottle rather than in cask, in glass as opposed to in wood. As port ages, it throws a crust or sediment. When port is bottled from a cask, the sediment is filtered out. But when aged in the bottle, the sediment remains in the wine. Decanting keeps the bits of grape and such out of your glass. So you can fully appreciate the years and skill that have gone into the making of this wonderful wine called port. If you want to make sure that the port you buy is the genuine article, check the neck for this seal. Without it, it's not port, because this seal comes from the Port Wine Institute. Port comes with two kinds of stoppers, a long cork like this and a reusable cork stopper like this. Now, vintage port comes with a long cork, so that in order to keep it, you have to lay the bottle flat in order that the cork is kept wet at all times. Those that come with the reusable stopper are usually tawnies and young rubies, and these can be stored standing up. When it comes to tasting port, whatever the color, the same principle applies. Lift the glass, look at the color. Beautiful rich color it is. Give the wine a swirl, because this releases the wine's bouquet. Give it a sniff, and then take some in your mouth and let it roll across the entire palate so that you get the full flavor of the wine. And that's how to enjoy port. What glasses are ideal for port? Well, the best style are those where the belly of the glass is larger than the aperture, because that concentrates the bouquet. And you can see that in all of these styles, apart from this one, you'll see that wide base and the narrow top. This one, the bouquet, the aroma of the glass is dissipated very easily. So try finding glasses with this shape, or if you have a real thirst, you can always find something like this. You've been watching Ports to Remember. Join me for the next program in the series.